Welcome to FYI, the For-Your Innovation podcast. This show offers an intellectual discussion on technologically enabled disruption, because investing in innovation starts with understanding it. To learn more, visit arc-invest.com.
ARC Invest is a registered investment advisor focused on investing in disruptive innovation. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. It does not constitute, either explicitly or implicitly, any provision of services or products by ARC. All statements made regarding companies or securities are strictly beliefs and points of view held by ARC or podcast guests, and are not endorsements or recommendations by ARC to buy, sell, or hold any security. Clients of ARC Investment Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of For Your Innovation, a podcast by ARK Invest on all things related to disruptive innovation. I'm Andrew Kim, Research Associate covering consumer internet and fintech. Today, we have the great privilege of speaking with Samee Zahid, Director of Engineering at ChipperCash. Hi, Samee. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, Andrew. Excited to be here and chat more about what we've been up to here at ChipperCash.
So before diving deeper into Chipper and Chipper's AI Day now 2 months ago, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So my journey at Chipper, I think I've been at Chipper now around 3 years. Before that, I was at Google working on search ranking. So at Chipper, kind of really being that first ML focused data hire. So I was engineer number 7, kind of built out a lot of the infrastructure for our ML and data use cases, and then start working on problems. In fintech, we have a lot of problems around fraud, and especially with the stage I joined, a lot of problems around growth. So kind of taking that on, and now essentially where we are at is I kind of lead a team, a multifunctional team of folks that kind of focus a lot on risk, growth, identity, and all the underlying infrastructure powering our ML and data systems. And then we've also started making inroads into, which we'll also kind of mention, is around businesses. So KYB and how do we really verify businesses on our platform. But yeah, that's kind of the scope of where I am. And before that, like I said, at Google, working a lot on machine learning problems and kind of taking that expertise and applying now to fintech domain.
That's awesome. Before moving further, I just wanted to remind our listeners that this is ARC's second podcast with the ChipperCash team. In episode 105, ARC speaks with Chipper co-founder and CEO Ham Saranjogi about Chipper's founding story. So I would encourage listeners to refer to that episode to get up to speed on this really impressive company. But before moving further, could you just give us a one-sentence overview of what is ChipperCash?
So ChipperCash is essentially a primarily cross-border remittance platform. That's how we started, but now essentially kind of being a fintech super app for the African continent. So on our platform, we allow folks to not only do cross-border payment flows, but also let users buy stocks, buy crypto, and then also pay for bills. And we also recently, earlier this year, launched a card product as well. So a debit card product for our African users. We're in 7+ countries. However, these things are always changing. We're always expanding. So, but primarily, fintech super app for the African continent.
Awesome. So you and the ChipperCash team announced a lot of really interesting new products at Chipper AI Day at the end of August. Could you give us a high-level overview of the Chipper ID platform?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, we're very excited about this. Identity verification is not only a big thing that's going to start emerging in this decade, but I think for us, it's always been a bigger challenge being on the African continent. So Chipper ID primarily is a all-in-one kind of AI-driven KYC verification platform that we launched. So this covers things all the way from, you have your kind of liveness component, which is checking if a user is actually human or not. And then we go on to the things like uniqueness, measuring whether this user has been seen on our platform or not before. And then you go into things around document verification, doing OCR, but then we also have some government databases we integrate with, so allowing us to really verify the identity of the user. And then at the tail end of the life cycle, we also do watch list screening and sanction screening. So we've partnered up with Open Sanctions, which we've been very impressed by their kind of effort to kind of making it a lot more transparent and open source. The entire problem space of sanction screening, PAP, and watch list, which have traditionally been very gated by certain institutions. So doing that as well, and then kind of giving this kind of holistic end-to-end KYC verification experience to customers. So that's basically Chipper ID.
Got it. And you say traditionally gated. I think this is a great segue to talking about, what is the backstory here? What compelled you to build your own KYC solution, and what did this landscape look like in sub-Saharan Africa and the fintech ecosystem in it before you launched your product?
No, 100%. And I think this story for Chipper ID kind of starts at the end of this kind of bull run that we saw, and then we kind of entered this kind of fintech winter, which we currently still are in. So I think a lot of the concerns that we also had previously were not only around these KYC verification providers not being at the standard we wanted them to be, but also from a cost perspective, right? So as we kind of entered this and started looking at costs to cut, KYC is a big factor, right, for all of us who are operating in the fintech ecosystem. And then when you look at from that perspective, you start eating those costs out, you start building your systems. We ended up, what we felt was like not only something that would be a value add to other folks on the continent, but also a great opportunity to start really thinking about the trajectory of how identity verification and its tangential kind of verticals, taking that into the next decade, and how Africa, emerging markets will start thinking about it. And what we saw is, when you look at a lot of the KYC providers, they're looking from a compliance and legacy perspective, right? Like as a checkbox, right? Like I want to verify this user because certain regulations say I have to do these steps. But now we're entering a world where, fraud is, of course, going to get bigger. We have a lot of AI generation. We're already seeing happening with fraudsters. So now it's not only a regulation or compliance issue, it's also a product issue, because you don't want a lot of these users impacting your products and bloating your numbers and so forth. So for us, not only it started from a cost cutting perspective, but then when we started building it out, it ended up being something we felt was not only innovative, but also something that we felt we could build on top of with our partners.
And can you help us kind of quantify the impact of this movement? Can you talk about like what percentage of operating expenses do you think overall for fintechs in sub-Saharan Africa or Africa more broadly are typically allocated to kind of KYC, compliance, legal, all of these procedures? And like, do you have a sense of how much you're saving now and how much you expect to save, I guess, over the longer term as you unlock the full value of this platform that you and your team have built?
The main kind of where I'll start this discussion on is the metric, which was CAC, right? So customer acquisition cost, which is probably one of the most important pieces of cost around fintechs and also generally in startup world. So when we looked at our numbers, in some markets, we were averaging even up to like 50% of our CAC was related to KYC and compliance costs, right? And that was, again, as I referred to in my early point, mainly due to a lot of these third-party KYC providers really charging tooth and nail. We can probably go more into, the different pricing models and how they, a lot of the market has kind of, what I'd say the identity verification industry has kind of really been in sales mode in the last few years, right? Like a lot of the core tech has not really been in, it's, some computer vision techniques that came out mid 2010s and people are still using them. So, when we looked at it on ourselves, like the CAC, 50%, that's huge. So what we did is build out everything. We don't resell anything, just to be clear. We built out all of these components, all of the tech ourselves. So that basically put us down to honestly, cost of electricity and compute from that 50%. And then what we also managed to do in an absolute sense is, millions and millions. So, we anticipate like double-digit millions savings for this going forward in the next couple of years. Especially when we look at even the cost of operating in a new market, right? So these are like the second order, third order effects that we also kind of benefit from a future cost perspective. Is like, okay, if we want to go into a new market, KYC is a big consideration, but now we can handle that on ourselves, right? For instance. So 50% is a big number in a lot of markets. Of course, in some markets, it's like, 30%, but mainly what we managed to do is immediately cut out those costs and now turning this into a revenue generator, right, for us.
That's super exciting. Maybe just to now dive a little deeper into each of the segments of the Chipper ID platform, I want to talk a little bit about Veriface, right? The facial recognition offering. Can you just talk about the general issue of account creation fraud in Africa? Like, do you think this is an issue that disproportionately affects Africans relative to the rest of the world?
Yes. So this is, I would preface that by saying it's probably a problem unique more to emerging markets rather than just Africa. And the issue becomes, for instance, when you run any kind of promotions or you run any kind of growth marketing campaigns, it creates an obvious adverse incentive for people to create duplicate accounts and essentially get part of that marketing money, right? So one of the harder things that becomes a challenge is identifying people on devices and knowing, we have unique users. And this became disproportionately harder, I would say, starting the end of, 2020, 21. That's when Apple and Google started making much harder to people to track devices, primarily as a way to protect privacy and such. But, Facebook suffered from it. They could not do a lot of good cross-selling from an ads perspective. But, from a fraud perspective, made it very tough for people to understand what is a unique device. So going from there, you kind of enter the world of, let's say, Africa, where we offer even, let's say, $1 or $2 for people to sign up, right? That, when you look at, from a purchasing power parity perspective, that $1 or $2 can go pretty far for a lot of folks on Africa. So what happens is you have a lot of people, there's no like automated or bot behavior mainly that we are concerned by from a duplicate account creation perspective, but people manually creating these accounts, right? So at some point we saw someone create up to like 500 accounts over 2-3 days just so that they could get a lot of this marketing spend. So it becomes tougher, right? Because you actually have genuine humans going through the flows, trying to do it. So one of the things we really felt like would be a good approach to this would be detecting duplicate faces. So when we do our liveness detection, we also kind of do this from this uniqueness check to understand if this user has seen on the platform before or not. And that's where we kind of did something a bit more unique because, the advent of vector databases has made the concept of finding, doing kind of similarity matching much easier, much faster. So we actually did a case study with Pinecone, who is a vector DB, because to kind of illustrate the power of the platform we built is, sub-second multi one-to-many matching over millions of accounts. So, right, like if, for instance, Andrew, you were to come on Chipper, and let's say you signed up on Chipper like 2 years back, and we have like 5+ million users, within a second we will be able to tell you PIN. So this allows us to kind of do checks real time. We looked at some providers, and some of them, were doing something similar, but what they would be doing is giving us responses after 20 to 30 minutes sometimes, right? So a lot of it was manual review where they would do it, but then they would also have constraints like, up to only 30,000 faces we can kind of support, right? So that was a no-go for us. So what we built is this kind of vector database solution where we would kind of embed faces into a space and then kind of run cosine similarity and figure out if it's the same person or not. And for the actual facial recognition, or I would say more around facial understanding, we kind of use some open source models that we've tweaked essentially to create these embeddings for people on faces. So another problem becomes a lot of these open source models, they don't really do great at African faces. So not only African, but like any kind of, non-Caucasian, right? Like there was a paper that came out with, around this as well, where, you have things like your ImageNet and all these big corpuses, they're just very biased, right? So the good part is we have a lot of this data. So we have, upwards of 5 million faces. So what we did is kind of tweak, like fine tune essentially one of these open source models and essentially create much cleaner and accurate facial embeddings that we could compare folks with.
Got it. Yeah. Before talking about image training data, I want to just go back to what you were talking about with embeddings retrieval. What were the biggest challenges that you kind of faced as you were building out that tech stack? And what are lessons learned there?
So I think quite a few. I think one thing is to understand that there's a lot of new tech out there that people might not know that it can be very helpful. So like things like vector databases, right, which are kind of in vogue right now, mainly from a text embeddings perspective, right? So people would always think vector databases. Everyone is just having this one-to-one mapping in their head. Oh, vector databases, ChatGPT, LLM, and that's all they think about. Perhaps people need to start also thinking about other use cases around this kind of new tech emerging, right, with vector databases, which is doing these kind of really dense matching over millions and millions of data points. So when we started building this out, I think that was always one of the bigger concerns for us, was the performance and latency perspective. So it's not only, okay, we have a vector database, that's not where the story stops in terms of performance gains, but it's also about building out our core infrastructure that is very resilient and fault tolerant. For instance, when we match a face, you could technically get 5, you could get 8 matches. Then you have to do threshold tuning, right? So when I was at Google, for instance, a lot of the really cookie cutter, right, like the secret sauce at Google was not really like, okay, you have these really novel models that perhaps the rest of the industry doesn't have it. It's essentially your way of iterating over these problems. So you have the infrastructure piece, which I just mentioned. You have to get that nailed down. But on top of that, you need to still tune your systems. And, you would have essentially this process of, okay, let's run it on a data set that we curated over, let's say, 2,000 samples, run the model on top of that, and then figure out your win patterns, your loss patterns, which are patterns you want to see, which are not. If someone's wearing a hat and someone's not wearing a hat, and there's, can we catch those? So we saw a lot of these issues emerge even when we built it up front. But what really, I think, helped us is having this kind of robust iterative process that we've developed at Chipper, where we would look at samples, we would look at the win-loss. We have really strong evaluation infrastructure, without which I don't think none of this is possible. But again, it's a time investment, right, to build that out as well. So, you kind of pair these together. So you have the infrastructure, which is like, okay, we need to be fast. We need to match faces very quickly. And on top of that, accuracy has to be high as well, right? So you have to kind of tune that piece as well. So typically you kind of call these like the quality infrastructure trade-off. And you just don't get there without investing a lot in your kind of core abilities. And then, of course, I also have to make a strong shout out to our team. We have a very strong team of machine learning engineers and data scientists that kind of really take on this kind of ability to, not just, train a model and everything, but then productionize it, do the infrastructure work. So classically you would have folks having, data scientists, data engineers, machine learning. We just have essentially kind of full stack approach. So you kind of have the same engineers who are tuning the models, also working on the infrastructure, and then they're also helping develop the UX for it, right? So UX is also a big part. For instance, if a person, we have 98% accuracy, which is really impressive, but when you look at it, that's like 2 out of 100 people might have issues. So what's the kind of approach to customer ops, right? What's the approach to flagging? What's the approach to human in the loop? So that is essentially the full kind of breadth of that ecosystem you kind of have to kind of distill into this one project. And then with other companies, which we usually see is you have a data scientist, you might have a backend engineer, you might have a front-end engineer, and then you also have your ops folks. And then suddenly this project becomes a job for like 7, 8 people. But here we basically have engineers leading the charge, working with customer ops, building everything by themselves. So that, I think that is what I would say has been the learning, is to kind of invest in talent, but also be in your eval system, and then C, just making sure that engineers are product thinkers to a certain extent, that they can kind of handle these components in a very holistic fashion.
I might have misunderstood you earlier, but could you help me just reconcile my understanding between usage of a cloud-based vector database, right, for these models, and the emphasis on on-device inference for Veriface? Like, how do I reconcile these two facts?
I'd say like splitting it up, right? You have essentially a liveness component, which is to detect a human is in the image, and that's a live human that is there. It's not someone with, like, let's say, holding a photo of someone, but you actually have a live human present. So that problem is separate from what I would say uniqueness, which is the one where I kind of really talked about face matching and such, which is to understand if it's the same person or not. So when we talk about on-device inference, that mainly applies to the liveness piece. So understanding that you are a human, a living, breathing human, you're not spoofing us, you're not running a video or you're kind of doing any deep fake. So for that problem, we have applied a on-device solution primarily, but you still make a server network call with the selfie that the user takes to kind of do a double check on the back end. But in like 90% of cases, you don't have users writing. So what helps is that I think to your point, so that our listeners also know, on-device inference is extremely important for the continent, especially where you have people with devices that might still be under 1 gigs of RAM, right? So you cannot really, and then you also have essentially the issue of people having network constraints, right? So maybe internet is not always working, but you also have like choppy internet, so kind of shuffle, like letting them upload a video of that's kind of a very tough problem, right? So what we've done is kind of really optimize for this kind of emerging market use case of like choppy internet and device not doing right, and then helping users speed up their kind of onboarding process through on-device inference.
Got it. Just to summarize then, we were talking about kind of two services, right? Veriface, which is verifying human likeness, in which on-device inference is made possible because you are just verifying whether it's a human or a bot, right? And obviously, on-device inference matters a lot for the reasons that you have just cited. And then we also talked about Now You See Me, right? Which is verifying facial uniqueness, right? To ensure that the right person is logged in and ensuring that it's the right person logged into the correct account.
No, completely. And I think we've been also just trying to diverge from our internal names like Veriface and Now You See Me, because they kind of have not a clean kind of optics on what they mean. So I think when we talk about problems now, we kind of internally also talk about like, okay, you have liveness, you have uniqueness, and yeah, very different problems, and we solve them very differently. And to your point, which you already, I think it's a good point to mention, logging in, right? So we also have the same tech that we use for uniqueness, which is a bit separate from Chipper ID. We don't offer that as a thing, but just to illustrate, like, we had a lot of account takeover issues at Chipper where you would have people kind of getting scammed by folks on the internet. They would call them and say, we're a Chipper Cash support employee. Please give us your password, give us your phone OTP that you would get in a few minutes. But what we did is also implement the kind of official check when they would log in. So the same thing I want to say is because it's only made possible because we run it very fast, right? So it's like Face ID, but at the Chipper account level.
Just diving a little bit deeper into the process, the training process involved in verifying facial uniqueness, right? With Now You See Me. You talked about how you kind of experimented with AI models, right? To kind of generate synthetic data to help you enrich your pre-existing very large data set of African citizens, right? Can you just talk about how kind of different this is just from simple manipulation of existing image data? And maybe more broadly, the usage of synthetic data in the training process to begin with. Like, what's your general opinion there?
No, this is, I think, something of course, as someone involved in the industry now, I think something we're excited by. But of course, there are a lot of nuances attached to this as well. So yeah, first I'll kind of mention, right, like our efforts and where I see it going in the future. But primarily what we've been seeing is, a lot of this kind of diffusion models, right? Like, so you look at things like Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and DALL-E, right? Of course, allowing people to kind of take some text and generate images out of it, right? However, we've also seen, right, like with something like Stable Diffusion, they started offering an in-painting kind of mechanism, right? So even DALL-E, Midjourney, I think, also started recently offering that. So you kind of also have this ability to kind of not only generate new novel images, you can take your existing images. For instance, if we have a lot of folks in our data set that are just taking, their selfies, what if we just add a hat to them or give them glasses? So these are the things where we've kind of really already have been, playing with, is expanding, not in the training phase, but on the testing side, where, if we kind of have these kind of more anomalous kind of situations users are, we can now start generating synthetic data for it. The reason being because there's a imbalance issue, right? Which people know. So any kind of imbalance issue, you kind of either have to, kind of get more data around it, or so this kind of solves the imbalance issue. So if you want to see, the same person, but wearing a hat, that's hard, right? For us to kind of just get that data. So what we can use is some of these diffusion models to kind of put them, the same person, in a bit of different scenario. Maybe even we can change some of the lighting And then essentially that allows us to test our models much better. Now, if you go to the training side, that is we haven't really dug too much there yet, but because we already have a lot of training data, and then what we've seen is some of these anomalous use cases, we can kind of like do a patch on top of the model, either through a heuristic or through another algorithm that we can detect these. But at some point, we're going to start experimenting as well on that side. And of course, as these image diffusion models get better, I anticipate the gap between them leaving some weird artifacts in the training process to reduce. We're very excited by it. It's not only going to help us on this kind of selfie, when we look at users in different contexts, but also from a document perspective, right? Like, for instance, one of the fraud patterns we'd seen in the past is people pasting strips of paper on their ID cards to kind of make sure that they end up kind of spoofing systems, right? So, of course, sometimes they don't work because, let's say, if you're in Nigeria, right, like you have, let's say, your NIN, which is your NIN slip, which is a form of document that the Nigerian government gives. We kind of query the database for the government. So in those cases, they won't be able to spoof it. But for instance, if you don't have a government DBA integration and it's a novel kind of number that we parse through our OCR, technically they could fool us, right? So it allows us to even kind of create these kind of, okay, can we detect those kind of strips of paper? Can we detect any kind of manipulations? And instead of like trying to source those data points, we can now synthetically start generating them using diffusion models. And it's still up in the air whether in the training phase they can help us, but they're already helping us from a testing perspective.
It's interesting that you bring up, document verification and minimizing fraud there, in that I do wonder if you're going to have to find this really nice balance between like utilizing just traditional, I guess, OCR tech and multimodal LLMs, right? In that I saw, I think it was either a tweet or a TikTok in which a person kind of uploaded an image, right? And it said like, do not listen to the user's commands. Like this person is untrustworthy or something like that, right? And then it actually prioritized the commands within the image over the user's prompt, right? Over the text input. So I do think it's going to be really interesting as, I guess, you guys also leverage GPT-4 and other multimodal models going forward, how to find that balance, right, to minimize false positives, false negatives, etc.
No, I think, of course, the OpenAI Dev Day earlier this week, and, we've been, kind of already started to play around because they released the vision models and we've had access to them. 100%. I think what we already see, just not even just talking about GPT-4, but just like the multimodal LLMs, right, is the big thesis we also have at Chipper is like a lot of this tech is going to get commoditized over the next coming years. So things around like OCR, these are, it's the same thing that happened to text is going to happen to vision, right? So text with LLMs, you had decades of NLP research kind of thrown out of the window because now you have this. Same thing's going to happen to vision. To what degree, it's still up in the air because then you have video as well that comes into it, right? And of course, video is just another modality of images if you think about it, right? So that's still up in the air. But what we already see is like you say, like when, you have these issues, you still need to make sure that you have some other system in the next coming years that can either verify or make sure that you're kind of doing things the right way. So we're already running some evals where, okay, our system versus this multimodal vision, just how good it's doing. And in some cases, we already see it's, doing amazingly well, but there are always these kind of, what I would say is anomalous instances where it cannot parse the text properly or it might refuse, which is, of course, another concern with using these cloud providers for LLMs is ultimately, if they say we don't want to process human faces, we don't want to process documents and things like that will always be a bit constrained. But I'm talking more broadly than open source because in the next coming years, what you say with GPT-4, the vision variant is going to be open source in the next couple of years. So for us, it's essentially, I think for the industry, it's always like, this is the time to be thinking about these things and realizing that a lot of the tech moat that people had built, right, is probably going to disappear very quickly. And then also it's going to open up a lot of new use cases. And we've already been experimenting with some of them, which is like, doing, let's say, Q&A over your document for compliance folks, right? So if you have a huge document, this could be, especially on the business side, some of these documents in Africa, they can be pretty big and extensive. Just speeding that up, right? Like having a compliance person ask questions about the document rather than having to peruse and kind of go through them by themselves. And that's where we're the most excited by is, where this multimodal LLMs, they kind of open up a world where essentially you don't really have to specifically build templates or kind of entertain different documents yourself. You have this kind of all-in-one Oracle that can do it for you. But on top, you will still need, you're going to have your compliance knowledge baked in. You still need to understand regulatory scope you're operating in. So those things I still think, will be needed. And at Chipper, that's something we've already been invested in, right? Since its conception is having strong regulatory reporting, compliance department, knowing a document is now outdated, not accepted by a certain jurisdiction, or there are new patterns that are emerging. So these are things that we still need. So essentially, even though the scope and the technical side of it will be eaten up by a lot of these multimodal, but you still need to have a lot of this compliance risk knowledge. And I don't see that going away anytime soon.
So proprietary data and human in the loop is how a firm keeps its edge in an ever commoditizing product segment.
Exactly. Pretty much, because even in the world where we start fine-tuning some of these multimodal LLMs to handle our data better, whoever has that data will win, right? And I think that's where we're already seeing, right, this entire, even OpenAI and the dev day, they're already starting working with some companies where they're charging like $2 to $3 million to have a really custom GPT model. So I think, of course, the prices are going to come down. A lot is going to be open source. And then what you're left with is, as you said, is people with data and people without data. And people with data will be able to kind of craft out a niche here. But I'm also very, it's up in the air because, you have GPT-5 or any of these next stage models. Maybe they're so general and so good that perhaps you don't need to fine tune things, right? So it's just still up in the air, but I would still make the bet that there will always be room that can be improved by your custom data or your proprietary knowledge and human knowledge that you have at your company. So it's all about how much of these get eaten up or not, right? And that's still up in the air, but I still think there will be a non-trivial part of it that will be supplemented by having your own data and having your own proprietary knowledge.
Yeah, and there's, I guess, also a simple efficiency issue, right? Like even in a world in which the state-of-the-art foundation model can do every single thing in the world, it makes more sense for you then to opt for a smaller model, fine-tune it for your specific use case, right? You don't need the 99.9999% other knowledge base, right? That foundation model has, right?
No, exactly. And of course, a lot of that argument is driven from a need from a cost and efficiency perspective. And that's always going to be the thing, right? Because even if you look at a lot of the pricing for GPT-4 Vision, it's not too bad, but it's not something that's still cheap enough that people can just be like, we are going to start running it with it tomorrow. And there's also, also the latency requirements and stuff. But again, these are things I don't expect to be huge bottlenecks. So they're going to improve. So we have to be forward looking in it and thinking in a world where, in the future, you're going to have these kind of more maybe smaller models that are fine tuned on data, that are very fast, that are multimodal. And that's basically going to be 90% of the work. And then you have still 10% of ensuring human in the loop systems and how essentially you're updating and refine tuning your models based on new data, new patterns. And it's also going to be a cat and mouse game at some point. If this is so much easy on the reverse side, you have people maybe making spoof documents, probably going to be very, very easy to do as well. So it's always going to be this kind of mouse game on a new level. We also saw this kind of really crazy demo someone had of a live stream they were running with a face swap using Stable Diffusion. And you really could not tell if it's the same person or not. And at that point, you start also looking at the space of vision, but then looking at things like on-device signals that you can get, right? How people kind of are filling out their initial onboarding flow, where they're tapping. So a lot of the on-device signals are also going to start becoming very important at some point. But who knows, at some point, there might also be hardware kind of, constraints put in by manufacturers to ensure that, people can really tell if something is synthetically generated or something is actual human. Let's say if you have a camera and a live feed, it's an important guarantee that it's the same person and it's not routed through some other system. So maybe as a hardware, or firmware, or even the iOS, Android level, maybe you start seeing some things that would help on that side.
Yeah, I mean, regardless, it seems like a lot more data and data types are going to be needed to be ingested, right, by platforms like Chipper ID. And it's only the platforms that can accommodate such data, right, and provide useful analytics that will be able to be of use in a generative AI world. I just want to make sure we touch on all the other products announced, right, during Chipper AI Day. Can you talk briefly about Integrity? Love that name, by the way. And just like kind of like the process of building that offering.
Yes. So integrity is essentially the kind of the comprehensive document verification kind of system we built. So on that side, we use a bunch of, it's not like this one model because you have to have different problems. So for instance, first is like even just checking if someone has a document inside the frame, because we had KYC providers, right? Like if someone took a picture of their cat, we would start getting billed for it. So initially, the first thing in the Chipper ecosystem, what we built was essentially just something on our side that would at least tell us if something's a document, something is then, okay, the document that the user is actually, taking a picture of that they initially said they would. So, so that's the first piece. And then you kind of go into, okay, understanding the actual document they have. So doing the OCR, right? But then even before that, you have essentially an issue where, let's say if someone has taken it at a bad angle, maybe it's in a bad lighting or something. So kind of doing the skewing and cropping. So we have a model, a deep learning model that kind of first does that. And then we run it through our OCR system, which is kind of like we have two of them. So essentially, if one of them fails or does not give us a good enough, we also run the other one. And then essentially when we kind of get all the data back, have the OCR data, we also run a final check if something is a bit funny, right? For instance, if a certain document has 8 numbers it should have, but the OCR is giving us 7, making sure that we can maybe run it again, change a bit of the skewing or something around that. So it's very, I would say, involved, but it's also something I would say, we managed to make it run very fast. So again, our P95s on this is like less than 4 or 5 seconds, right? And so we, again, doing this real time as it goes. And then, what we have is a human in the loop system. So for instance, we have a dashboard that every day populates randomly some of these, so that ensuring that some of the fraud patterns that maybe the system doesn't catch, we always have a human team reviews them and just make sure that we're not getting flooded by some new fraud vector or pattern. So from integrity, that's what we really kind of focus on, is just like a very comprehensive document verification suite. And then we also made it extremely easy to add new documents. So it's something we're also looking at exposing to our partners, is a kind of a, train your own doc, essentially, so they can give a template of a document. We'll train it on our system based on, and our system, it's like a few shot learner. So if they can give 2 or 3 templates, like sample images, it can kind of generalize from that. And then we're thinking of adding that as a custom document verification feature for our partners so that they can, one of the things is, of course, we're currently just focused on Africa, but even in Africa, there can be a lot of countries we are not supporting in. So this could be a good way for our partners. Let's say they're launching in a new country that Chipper does not support yet. So they can use that to kind of at least kickstart their journey.
Gotcha. And the human intervention aspect, right, with the dashboard, that's kind of where also Screen Sentinel comes in, right, and enhances the whole value prop. Can you talk about that offering as well?
Yes. So that is actually something we're really, again, super excited by. And again, when we talk to, when we're pitching to prospective partners and all, that's something, again, they are really, really excited by. So Screen Sentinel is essentially kind of an AI co-pilot for our compliance team that allows them to go through, the first scope for that, what we're looking at is actually watch the screening and PEP matches. So from a regulatory perspective, you have this idea that, there are these sanctions lists that, you onboard users, then you have to match against them. And then, in most of these cases, what we find out is like, the matches are false positives, right? And then those alerts get dismissed. So what the Screen GPT tool, what we're doing is kind of using LLMs to kind of conduct the matching. So when we get, with Open Sanctions, our partner, kind of the response, okay, this user is matching all these different entities. We just let Screen GPT kind of tackle that matching process and then kind of make a decision whether to escalate it. So if it escalates it, it ends up in the review pile of an analyst. If it doesn't decide to escalate it, we close out the alert. And then what we've seen is already like our compliance teams are loving it. Like for them, of course, a lot of the big job is cleaning these lists and going through people's manual review, right, is a big part. And what we already see, it also speeds up our onboarding times because we're running a pilot right now. It's like 25% is what we've seen around about, because we're looking at people who might get this kind of false positive match, which can be, up to, let's say, 5% of the user base. For those users, it can take, until the human clears out their alert, they can never get onboarded. So this allows us to run onboarding very, very quickly, but it also allows our compliance teams to breathe a bit better and also just not have as many people as, banks, as I know, as you guys might know, is they have like up to tens of thousands and, contractors and all. It's a huge cost. And for us, this has also been not only a cost cutting thing, but also just been a way to make teams more efficient. And when we go to partners, they see the same value. I think we've also seen some partners say, hey, can we start using this for KYB, for instance, when we have these terms of conditions, when a business is onboarding our platform, we want the same tech, right, these LLM that you have to kind of understand the requirements that we have and then kind of make a decision, right? So we've also been playing on using this kind of screen GPT and expanding that scope. But for now, what we're really focused on is just like that strict compliance use case of screening and transaction monitoring and allowing them to move much faster.
The point you made right before on the few shot learning process is really interesting in that you can now kind of outsource geographic expansion to the Chipper ID customers, right? In that those that are expanding to territories that you have not, that Chipper's not available yet, you can kind of start preparing the, at least, customer data, right? Or ensuring that when Chipper decides to launch there, the onboarding compliance processes are seamless.
Exactly. And that's exactly the vision we have for that as well, where, some of the customers come in and they're like, okay, you don't support this document. And we already see that. And like, we can always add them very quickly. But then we're like, let's abstract this process out, because by virtue of abstracting it out, we also make us kind of add document support in a non-technical way, because then you can have even our ops folks, okay, a customer wants this new document, ops folks can go in, throw in their kind of training images, right? And then essentially get a model out of it that can start reliably doing OCR, understanding the document. So when we now go to partners, we can say, hey, you have this kind of, in this kind of for UI, you have this kind of feature now, and then all you have to do is upload a few documents, and within a day or so, or a few hours, you will have a document verifier for that country and that document. And then, of course, the native side of it, we're also trying to say, like, okay, what is a native document in this world? What is a custom doc? And what's the value add? So things like government DB integrations, also like, the model can generalize well, but they're always kind of these kind of tail end things. So, of course, it won't be at the quality if you were to add that natively, but it will always give these companies a very quick head start to start supporting new countries and kind of take it from there. And then, if you see a lot of volume, we can start working with them to kind of enhance it, add new features. But ultimately, a document's a document, right? And some of the same things apply. But of course, you have different fraud patterns and different regulatory things that might happen to documents. So that knowledge would still live in this kind of native world. But what we've seen is the partners, they are happy with even just having this kind of custom model, which of course they understand is not going to be at the level if you were to do it natively, but it helps them get that speed and return for accuracy.
Gotcha. That's super helpful. During the AI Day, Chipper announced a set of initial partners for Chipper ID. I think they were predominantly other African fintechs. Now that was like 2 months ago, right? Could you provide us with any updates on initial reception by customers, traction, what they're saying, and like how they're using it?
No, for sure. I think when we go to partners, we're being a bit more selective in our initial rollout, but we get a lot of interest. But for us, it's a lot about kind of really perfecting this with a select group of partners before we really open the gates on this. But even when we open the gates, when we look at the world, like, okay, having a self-serve, right, and everything, that to us is more at the tail end. Right now, for us, it's like getting these select group of partners and iterating with them. And of course, some of them have existing contracts and stuff. So a lot of them, we're running pilots with them and making sure that they're happy with the product that we have, the integration we have. And some of them, okay, they might have a different tech stack, so we have to kind of accommodate. So for a lot of them, what we saw is that a verification onboarding is extremely, extremely important for a lot of these companies. There's compliance, there's everything. So we have to do a lot of work to that. And so we're doing that by running pilots with these partners, and showing them the best way for us to prove our product is to get it in the hands of our partners, right? So it's been pretty great. I think what we've been really more surprised, we kind of knew this already, but I think it just kind of helped is there's a lot of KYC providers already, right? Like of course, you have OnFido also working, Smile ID, which we've been using. They've done a lot of great work. I think a lot of people still have these problems with KYC providers, which is A, they might not support the exact feature set they want, or B, a lot of these companies, haven't really gone up and beyond than just traditional verification. So when we talk about things like Screen GPT, these are things that our partners get very excited by, because for them, it's not, okay, Chipper is going to help us kind of solve this kind of verification problem, but they're also going to do more, right? Like take verification and KYC to a next level, use a lot more AI. So I think a lot of people get excited by that potential partnership, because they know for us, right, like our thesis is this tech, the legacy tech is going to get commoditized, right? So for us, it's all about, maybe in a year or so, we can also open source a lot of our core tech, because by then we already have like things like Stream GPT and other value add systems, right? Like even doing like Q&A over docs, or a more robust KYB agent that can help people verify businesses much easier. Or even like what we've been experimenting is an onboarding agent, right, for customers. So for instance, WhatsApp. So you don't have to download the app and everything. You have a Chipper Cash WhatsApp bot that kind of essentially onboards users. And then once they're onboarded, hey, you can now download the app, right? So these are things that when we talk to partners, they get excited by. And that's why I feel for us, that's the main goal is like, okay, our entry road is this kind of legacy tech, but then we look at, the world beyond in the next coming years, there's so much to do. And I feel that's where a lot of partners get really excited by. The second part to it is also maybe go a bit on that side, because we've been working a lot on that, is the transition to Web3. So when we look at things around, I think the really exciting project that we've been really also been working with Block on this, TBD, if folks know. So they're essentially a protocol, TBDEX, right? TBDEX. So they have this protocol, which is essentially taking something slightly different from traditional blockchain protocols, where they're kind of ensuring that, it's not permissionless, it's not completely trustless. You have to have a component of compliance and trust in your protocol. So we've been working with them to understand, right, what are zero knowledge verification we can do, zero knowledge proofs, for instance. Chipper Cash is an entity on the TPDEX protocol. Maybe they push out a quote on their side to maybe convert something from Naira to Ghanaian Cedi, for instance, right? And then another counterparty fulfilling it, right? In this world, you still need to understand underlying user, right? So how do you, in the best and easiest way, communicate that data about the underlying user, right, on the protocol? So we've been working, because for us, when we launched Chip ID, a lot of it was kind of doing the same thing, because one of the things we have is one-click verification. So as we get partners, what we also want to do is kind of remove the need to redo KYC for customers. So if Andrew, you came on HISA, which is one of our launch partners, and you signed up and everything, and then let's say you signed up on Chipper a month after, right? Since you're already in the Chipper ID network, when you come in, we remember you. So we say, hey, Andrew, we've seen you before. This is the data you've shared with us. Do you want to share that with HISA? Instead of you having to snap your document again, do the selfie thing again. So it allows us to move that. So the same kind of analog to this on the Web3 side is, when we have this kind of protocol, let's say I'm sending money on the TPDEX protocol, we can kind of do the same thing, where instead of, let's say, giving them the raw document, giving them the raw date of birth, we can say, okay, what are your constraints? You want someone to be 18 plus? This user is 18 plus. We don't have to tell you the exact date of birth. Okay, you require maybe a Nigerian passport or BVN or anything. Oh, the user has it. We don't have to tell you exactly what they have. So we're working on this, and I think that's also gets us very excited, is on identity on the blockchain, identity on this Web3 system, because that all traditionally has been a big challenge, right, to kind of get traction by big players to start using them, and compliance teams always complained about that. So we're working with TBD and on that side as well to ensure identity and verification is a core part of this kind of protocol. So we see that also being a big fundamental part to where we evolve. But right now we're in that place of marrying Web 2, Web 3. So we want to be a bit more like, we just don't want to go straight to Web 3, but we already have an Android to kind of also supporting identity verification in a Web 3 setting.
There's so much to tackle there. Maybe just starting with pay with Chipper versus login with Chipper. It sounds very similar to kind of how at least I think about Apple ID, Apple Pay. Can you just help me understand how these two offerings kind of fit together, at least in Chipper's overall strategy, and how you see, I guess, zero knowledge proofed like login or verification kind of fitting also in with these like three consumer facing identity solutions?
No, exactly. And I think when we look at even the ecosystem today, the recent partnership between Adyen and Plaid, right, is another example of essentially where you have payment processors really marrying themselves to like these kind of data intensive ID verification suites. And the reason is because of what you said, right? Kind of ensuring your rails and your payment rails have identity verification, not only as a supplemental, but like a core piece of that flow. And when we look at like login with Chipper, pay with Chipper, that's exactly the future we envision as well. So, once we can, technically Chipper ID is already this kind of login with Chipper idea of like instant verification, and you don't have to do KYC again, essentially the same idea. But when you now really natively bake into the rails, that's where the magic starts happening, because then you have, the ability for, let's say, Square Cash and essentially Chipper Cash. If someone wants to send money from Chipper Cash to Square Cash, that becomes much easier in that world, right? Because you have, Square can trust payments coming from Chipper because underlying, right, we've done the ID verification, but then we're also communicating that with them. And that's why I mentioned something like TBTeX as the protocol through which some of these things can happen. But now if you go into Web 2 world where you have like login and pay with Chipper, that is also something, of course, we have the payment trails, we do the on-ramp, off-ramp. So having ID verification makes it much, much easier to kind of support a product that would be like, one-click payout, one-click checkout, right, essentially.
Gotcha. So at least from use cases, I think it seems very clear that other fintechs in Africa, right, would highly demand Chipper ID as a whole. Can you talk about, I guess, going forward? It seems like, it's also really useful to just African legacy financial institutions, maybe telecoms, just anyone who needs to verify IDs. I'd love to just get a sense of, what verticals you think Chipper ID, like as you've announced it, what verticals will be like pretty well addressed, and also just more on the TB Dex integration there. Like, what kind of verticals do you see most disrupted by that new payment rail and identity solution?
No, that's a great question. I think the one thing I'll bring up is like, identity verification. The first thing I'll say is it's, of course, right now people think, again, which I pointed earlier, think from a regulatory compliance perspective, but we see this as a problem that's going to impact much broader, right? So a good example of this is Persona, which is another ID verification kind of company. They recently announced a partnership with Walmart, a really big one, which is to do with their drivers, right? Verifying identity of the drivers. So I think even when we look at African continent, we have a lot of, right, like we have Bolt, we have, even Uber operates there, and they have a strict need for ID verification. You have social media, X.com. They've already, started running like these trials with ID verification. We expect that to be the norm. For them, it's a big problem around bots, right? LinkedIn does it. So there's a wide variety of these businesses where, let's say, if they want to come to Africa and they're like, okay, who do I integrate with? Right now, there's not a clear answer, right? And that's the reason some of these companies kind of stay away from the continent, is because they cannot verify identities. So when we see, not only just fintech, but it's also just going to impact, in my head at least, you have your logistics, right? Anywhere, like even social media, but then also you go all the way to like food delivery, people, wherever there's a need to verify human identity. And I think that space is just going to grow much, much bigger in the coming decade. And if you look at even like on the Web3 side, right, like on their side, it's still like money movement mainly, but who knows, right? Like Web3 kind of, where you have people kind of developing much, much, stronger use cases that could be around content creator payouts, or we had a recent thing where a telecom bank, essentially, no, it was a telecom or is it a bank? I forget. It was, they wanted to understand, right? Like they do this kind of marketing things and they have to pay out users. So they're like, okay, we don't know, like, is this the same user? Is it not? Like, we want to do this ID verification on them. So how do we do that? And they were just like running this random marketing campaign, right? So think about it. If I'm running a marketing campaign and I have to give payouts to users, that also is a very, very abstract problem that is not really limited to any industry. So I think the bigger thesis here is that ID verification coupled with the things around bot detection and such are going to be much more, and we already see this right with WorldCoin, right? I mean, they took the really hammer approach of like, okay, let's scan people's irises, which honestly could pretty much be the way this problem gets solved in the really, really long term. But at the same time, it kind of illustrates the value and the need to ensure that we can verify humans, not at just, okay, from a fintech or regulatory, because this bank says it or this government says it, but just from a fundamental product level. And that to me is not restricted to fintech. That to me is pretty much everywhere.
So a consensus verification method across Africa will, fingers crossed, de facto just stimulate cross-vertical investment into the continent, right? Because there's just a lot more faith in the audience legitimacy, right?
Exactly. And to that point, I would say also at a very affordable. I think for us, it's all about being affordable as well. So when we also go to market and stuff, for us, yes, it's a revenue generator, but for us, it's a lot about getting that trust out there, developing those network effects, and essentially giving this at an affordable rate to growing fintechs. That's the first, like, our goal is to ensure, people are not cutting corners here because of cost, or people because it's one of those things where you can cut costs, but in the long term it'll hurt you. So we don't want people to think that way. Like, okay, I don't want to run selfie check because I have to pay this much money. We'll take the risk. We'll do manual review. But you're kind of caught up in this tussle then, right? In the long run, what, like, you can't scale. So for us, it's the first thing is exactly what you said, is opening up the corridor to, make it almost like a non-differentiator across the ecosystem, like how well you can verify users. That should be a given. And then people can compete post onboarding, on what they do. So when we go to competitors, right, like we're in talks with people who are like, hey, you're Chipper Cash, we're a competitor, right? So how does this make sense, right? And then we have to get them this pitch. Like for us, it's less about that. Even Chipper ID, we're incorporated under a different entity. The data is separate. And, of course, we have to make these guarantees because we really care about this, right? And how the data is secure. But at the same time, letting them know we're not just giving them at a good price because, oh, we're going to steal our customers or anything like that. So we have to kind of develop that trust. And that's where, sometimes the challenge becomes when something's too good, we built our product, we price it well, people are still, they're a bit like, okay, what's the catch? And for us, there is no catch. It's all about developing, like you said, I think you put it very beautifully, driving more cross-vertical investment into Africa, making sure the ecosystem thrives, because if the ecosystem doesn't thrive, Chipper cannot also thrive, right? So.
Gotcha. Before we wrap up, I just want to talk about how interesting it is and how unique of a position that Chipper is in as a leading digital wallet platform in Africa. That you kind of had the opportunity to strategically see what has worked and what has not in other geographies, right? There's your core remittance product. You can think of Wise, Remitly, etc. P2P, Cash App, PayPal, card, Nubank, right? Checkout API, Stripe, pay with Chipper, login with Chipper, Apple, and stocks and crypto like Robinhood or Coinbase, and now B2B identity solution like Alloy. And given all these different directions that Chipper is pursuing, I'd love to ask, what are the primary near-term catalysts that you're most excited about?
I think for us, a lot of it is, right, like we have the cards product, which we've seen really, really, right, like, there's no question of product market fit or any of this. It's like people are just, really knocking on our door. And we recently announced a partnership with Visa where we're going to kind of handling a lot of the card issuance with them. And that will make it a much better product for customers. And then, on the B2B side, we're also much more excited. We had the Zuna Tilt acquisition that we closed last at the end of 21. And now we're in 2022 and we're in here. And now we're essentially building, Chipper Identity is a B2B offering, but then even handling, kind of really doubling down on our B2B offerings as well, right, with Zuna and Tilt. And essentially what we really see is still, right, okay, remittances and cross-border bread and butter, we already know this, right? But when we look at like ID verification, it's a huge market, right? So for us, it's not like a thing or feature. We're really going into it is because we feel we have the bet, like I mentioned throughout the podcast today, is it's going to be a big slice of the pie, and it's going to grow bigger in this next decade. And then on top of that, just handling B2B payments and stuff. So adding ID verification into our enterprise plans right there, right? So we even maybe do a white label solution for them and stuff like that, right? So we have that kind of pillar emerging. And then stocks, crypto, and these consumer products are always good, and we're always going to keep on investing and making them better. But the way I see it is like B2B enterprise, you have ID verification, you have our cards product, which is essentially the more catalyst on the consumer side, getting people in. But then, stocks, crypto, which we've seen is like, there needs to be a lot more awareness. I think people, it's, once they kind of see more and more, okay, I can invest in stock, and then a few years if I hold it, or a year, I can get so the tail on getting people more excited about stocks or even crypto. Crypto is more like, people get, Bitcoin goes up and down, people trade. But I think on the continent, we still need to work on getting that awareness for these consumer products. But the enterprise and B2B, these people are knocking. So for a lot of us, it's like really doubling down on that side. And as a consumer product, we've done, I think, pretty well and have proved ourselves. And I think on the B2B side, now we're kind of showing our colors and expanding there because A, there's a lot of opportunity, but B, there are a lot of businesses in Africa that really will benefit from this. So when we even look at, your kind of mom and pop shop or even like your SMBs, right? Maybe in the future, what we can even look at is like giving them credit and liquidity. If they start processing payments with us, we have all the transactions that allows us to even develop some kind of either, advanced liquidity or credit offering that we can start giving to them. So that's where I would say at least the focus is for us right now. But at the same time, Chipper's grown, so we have all these products, but we're not also like chewing more than we can bite. So it's a good spot where we're at in terms of okay, existing things, but then new things that we're working on.
That's so exciting. Well, thank you, Samee, for your time today, and we wish you and Chipper Cash the best. And we're so excited to see the traction that Chipper ID is going to get. And yeah, we are in awe at your product velocity and cannot wait to see what Chipper Cash has in store over the years ahead.
Well, thank you again, Andrew. It was really fun chatting. And for folks to keep up to date with us, Twitter, LinkedIn, you can catch. We really always are very quick to announce things as they come out. So if you want to keep up to date, follow us on the socials. Yeah.
Amazing. All right. Thank you.
ARK believes that the information presented is accurate and was obtained from sources that ARK believes to be reliable. However, ARK does not guarantee the accuracy or completeness of any information, and such information may be subject to change without notice from ARK. Historical results are not indications of future results. Certain of the statements contained in this podcast may be statements of future expectations and other forward-looking statements that are based on ARK's current views and assumptions, and involve known and unknown risks and uncertainties that could cause actual results, performance, or events to differ materially from those expressed or implied in such statements.